Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'll get started. It's about 6:30. So thanks for joining us for our webinar tonight with Ed Robinson about the secret lives of white-tailed deer. My name is Julia McLeod. I'm the Outreach Director for the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust. And I wanted to let you know about some other upcoming events in our Stories of Change series. If I can, there we go. So you can see the next 3 months, we have some interesting webinars coming up. On April 14th, we have a webinar by John Banks about the restoring the sea run fish to the Penobscot River. So all about the Penobscot River Restoration Project. On May 10th, we have a webinar on promoting equity and inclusion in the environmental movement with Amara Afeji. And on June 24th, we have a webinar from Jonathan Allen about Bailey Island to the Barrier Reef, sea stars as sentinels of a changing world. So we'll have one a month for this whole year, a lot of really interesting speakers coming up. I hope that you'll join us. So for this webinar tonight, I'll just let you know that we're recording it, but we can't see you. I don't think I'll ever get used to talking to an empty screen, but it is what it is. And I'm going to encourage you to ask any questions you have in the chat. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little chat icon. You can type in questions at any time during the webinar. I'm not going to ask Ed to answer them right away, but I'm going to keep track of them. And then at the end, I will answer those questions. I'll ask Ed those questions at the end. So I will turn it over to Ed. Ed, I've been reading Ed's writing for many years now, as he's been writing wildlife articles for our email newsletters and his 2018 book, Nature Notes from Maine. And every one, I learn a little bit, something a little bit new. So I'm really excited to have Ed come and talk to us tonight. And I'll turn it over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Julia. You summed up my goal with this presentation, just like previous presentations: a little bit of entertainment, a little bit of education, a little bit of fun, and I hope everybody enjoys it. I'm going to share my slides here. Okay. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. I created this presentation a few months ago at the request of folks living in Highland Green. They've got a lot of problems with too many deer. And if you know anything about deer, you know that an excess of deer can be a serious issue. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But I'm also going to talk about their lives, their habits, some things I suspect some of you just don't know. And I hope you enjoy it. Deer are not creatures of the open, and I use this term here. They're creatures of the edges. A lot of people think that if you go into virgin forest, you'll find deer all over the place, but that's not true. They need new growth. They need browse. They like fields and brush lots and habitat like that. So they live on the edge of wild habitat. This lovely little creature was on the edge of the driveway to my cabin when I pulled up in June a few years ago. I heard a rustle and I looked out the window and there she was. She held dead still until I fumbled around to grab my camera and got this picture. Her mother was about 120 feet away and very concerned about me, of course. And she finally gave a snort and the fawn stood up and ran off, but it was great to be this close to a beautiful little creature. The other thing about deer is that they live in the shadows. They're mostly nocturnal. I actually had a gentleman from Bailey Island say to me in an earlier wildlife presentation that he didn't think that there were any bucks living on Bailey Island, even though there were lots of does around, the females. And I said, well, that's because you're probably not walking around Bailey Island at night when the bucks particularly are most active. They have fantastic eyesight. As you can see from this trail camera photo, They have very powerful retinas, lots of cones in their eyes to detect things at night that we cannot see, of course. So you need to be out and about in the dark. I'll share some facts here. You're looking at a female, the doe, as they're called. And in Maine, we have some big deer, much bigger than you would find in Texas and Florida. There are rules about evolution, and the farther north you go, the bigger the creatures. A mature doe around Harpswell would normally be 100 pounds, but there's one on record that tipped the scale at over 200. That was a female that had antlers. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Their ears are one of the most prominent features, and these are extremely important for their security, their lifestyle. They can rotate those ears. We cannot. Their hearing isn't necessarily better than ours, but with those big ears wiggling around, they can pick up sounds that we would not be able to do. Their nose, however, is tremendously powerful. They have something like 300,000 sensors in that big, long nose, and they can pick up smells a mile away that we would need to be within 100 feet, for instance. Because of the placement of their eyes and the fact that they're actually bulging a little bit, they have 300-degree vision straight on, where ours is only about 170 degrees. And obviously, if they turn their head just a touch, they can see all the way around them. Their color vision is not good. They don't see colors as we do. They mostly see shades of black and white and grays. That's why during hunting season, you'll see people in hunter orange or lime green for safety reasons. The deer don't really see that as a bright orange color. But they're highly attuned to movement. If you move at the wrong time when you're trying to watch a deer, take a photograph, whatever, they detect that in a heartbeat. And if it looks like it's a threat, then they're off running up to 40 miles an hour. That's as fast as a thoroughbred at peak speed. They don't run for long distances. They just do it enough to get to where they feel safe. In the midst of that run, they can leap 30 feet on the ground and as high as 8 feet. So that little 3-foot fence you have around your garden with all those tasty greens is not going to make it if you're trying to keep the deer out. The does normally breed at 1.5 years old in the fall of their second year. Their range and habitat is really diverse and expanding in North America. They can live as far north as the tundra and as far south as Peru. They're very actively expanding in the western United States and causing problems because they're pushing the more reclusive mule deer out of areas that are traditional habitat for mule deer. So in the river bottoms in Montana and Missouri and places like that, you'll find whitetails everywhere. And they can live at sea level, as this doe is, John Barry photographed, to low mountains. You're not going to find them at 10,000 feet. They might be 4,000 or 5,000 feet, maybe 6,000 feet. They particularly like agricultural and riparian areas. Riparian means river valleys and deltas. Anywhere there's water and less vegetation that grows because of that water, creating wonderful feed for them. And as I mentioned, they're looking for edges, not old growth forest. They do particularly well where there's regeneration. If there's been a fire, if there's been logging, if there's been a big windstorm, that opens up new habitat, new growth that whitetails feast upon. Their diet most of the year is quite varied, and they are opportunistic in what they eat. They'll move around a lot for favored foods. So in the spring, you might see them in your backyard. In the summer, you don't see a deer. And in the fall, they may be back. It just depends on what's available to them. But they are the classic free-range, organic, vegetarian eaters. and they'll consume 5 to 10 pounds of food a day, depending on the size of the animal and depending on the season and what they're eating. The acorns at the bottom are a particular favorite in the fall when the oak trees and other nut-bearing trees begin to drop nuts. They feast on those because it's a high energy, high fat, high protein food for them. They're packing on layers of fat to get through the winter. This is classic deer habitat in the late fall and the winter. And you'll see lots of buds and twigs. There's actually 4 deer in this photograph. See if you can spot all 4 of them. They will also eat nuts if left over. You'll see them digging through the snow or moving leaves aside to find leftover nuts. Fruit, if there's apples on a tree or dropping on the ground, they'll be after those. And crop residues, particularly things like soybean or clover, any corn that's left over. All winter long, they will be traveling miles to get to fields like that to find that food. Sometimes they get in trouble. And in the area I grew up in the Finger Lakes, they are a real pest around farms that are growing grapes. A lot of high energy, a lot of carbohydrates there, and the farmers routinely get permits from the state to knock down the deer population. My wife Mary was very upset this year when a deer came onto our porch and using its front foot broke into her favorite pumpkin and started eating the meat out of the heart of it. Pumpkin farmers have a lot of losses to deer. And of course, if you're a gardener and you're in deer country, you're going to have trouble. We lived in London a long time and grew to love tulips, but you can't grow tulips in Harpswell unless you got a good fence around them. The deer love them. They're like candy. Hosta, the plant on the right, is another example of a food that deer will browse sometimes 2 or 3 times in a season. I don't know why we try, but we like hosta. When things get cold and food sources are scarce in the winter, they will browse on rhododendrons, even though there's not a lot of nutrition there, and that's a very woody plant. But I've seen them stand in the window of our house chewing on rhododendron leaves, even the twigs, and hydrangeas. They'll browse hydrangeas right down to the ground some years. If the weather is extreme, lots of snow, lots of cold, and they have no choice, they will browse on a lot of conifers, even though some of them are very bitter and have almost no food value for them. On the left, this poor shrub has deer fencing around it, but they've managed to push through and nibble and chew it down. It's just terrible. Balsam is a particular favorite. I have a lot of trouble with them at my farm. The deer love to rub their antlers on balsam because they smell good to us and to deer. Whitetail, the name whitetail signifies something important about these creatures, and that is that tail. The deer in the foreground here is using that tail to signal concern, a warning, nervousness, and you can see those tails through the woods at great distance, and the other deer are obviously looking for that tail. In various positions, that tail may also signal submission if they're being intimidated by a larger deer. And later you'll see a picture of a doe submitting to breeding with a buck by holding her tail in a particular way. The deer actually can make a fair number of noises, and some of them I'd like to display for you here. They make, depending on their age, what's called a blat or a bleat. The fawn will call for its mother, and an adult doe during breeding season will signal a willingness to breed. I hope you can hear that, but that's a sound that you'll hear in the woods, particularly in the fall. They'll also, the males will grunt during the breeding season, especially if they're walking hard, they've been fighting, they've been breeding, or they're excited about an estrus doe in the neighborhood. They'll make this sound. Sounds more like a pig than a white-tailed deer, but that's, again, readily heard in the fall. And then snorts and wheezes. They'll breathe out through their nose very quickly. It sounds more like a high-pitched whistle, and that carries a couple hundred yards in the woods, and they're very attuned to that noise. They're beautiful creatures, of course, and in May, the fawns are born. Depending on how many the doe delivers, they range between 4 and 8 pounds. They're helpless at birth, but within 4 hours, they'll struggle to their feet, 3 hours, excuse me, and begin walking. But for the first week, they really are unable to avoid predators. But Mother Nature has a solution to that. The fawn has almost no scent. So other than a black bear or a coyote that has extremely sensitive sense of smell, most animals cannot find a fawn, and the mother actually separates them from her and separates 2 or 3 if she has them to protect them. In this picture on the right, you'll see 3 fawns. That was taken at our farm by a trail camera, and I was delighted to see that because that means both the doe is healthy, but the habitat is healthy. She will not bring fawns into the world unless she is comfortable that there's a good chance of survival for them. The doe can actually absorb a fetus if she's under stress in the winter, or if there's not enough food, she will not bring young into the world. They're obviously delightful little creatures at this age, of those beautiful eyes and the spots. And they're very inquisitive. I've had them walk right up to me if you're quiet. If mom's not around, they're curious, they're exploring and learning as they go. As they grow a little bit bigger, the spots begin to fade. And normally in the fall, late fall, when they've developed their full winter coat, extra long guard hairs grow in for insulation, the spots will vanish. Sometimes you'll see them in the spring of the following year. We all grew up with images from the movie Bambi by Walt Disney that told the story of a fawn that grows up into an adult deer. And the movie represented deer as these lovely, gentle, sensitive creatures. And in fact, they can be much of the time, but they can also be aggressive, even to each other. And a small fawn suffers abuse from larger fawns, even physically striking. And an adult deer is a dangerous creature. You should never approach an adult deer, because if they strike with that hoof, they can actually break your arm. And people have been gored approaching a mature buck with a full set of antlers during the breeding season. They're very territorial, they're full of hormones, and they can be dangerous. So just keep that in mind if you're trying to watch them. I thought I'd talk a little bit about antler development because that's one of the prominent features about deer, and one of the things that some people love to see. These are 3 different age group bucks. The one on the upper left is in his 2nd year, and he's going to end up with just a short spike, as it's called, a straight antler on the head. You can see them growing. You'll notice how skinny his face is. It looks elongated, and how skinny his neck and his haunches are. This is a very young buck. The one in the lower left hand is probably 2.5, maybe 3.5 years old. And you can see he's got a more developed set of antlers, 3 on a side. But the guy on the right is a serious buck. He is probably 3.5, maybe as much as 5.5 years old. When you see that kind of width outside his ears, and the mass and the number of points at maturity, this buck would be a really spectacular creature. I only saw him live once. I have him on a game camera at night a couple times, but he was primarily nocturnal. That velvet that you saw in the summer brings blood and nutrients to the antlers as they develop. They can grow as much as 1 inch a day. and they need a lot of minerals at that point in time. But in late summer, that velvet dries up and begins to smell and fall off. This guy looks a bit of a mess. And he'll actually rub that against trees and shrubs to get rid of it. He doesn't want it. Depending on where he chooses to rub, that will color this bone, raw bone, white bone, and they'll develop colors of mahogany, rich brown from oak. It just depends on where he chooses to knock it off. This is an example of a mature buck in early autumn. You can see the powerful muscles in his front and front shoulders and in his rear quarters. Notice his neck. The neck is much thicker than that small buck we were looking at earlier. And in the fall, this is caused by hormones. They begin to produce more and more testosterone, just as human males do. And you'll see his head, his face has swollen up a little bit. He looks like a heavier, more mature animal. And indeed he is. This guy is a giant for a whitetail. If I ever see one this side, I think I would faint. They're very rare to see a buck with antlers that size and a very large body as well. They mature sexually at 2.5 years old. They can breed in their first full fall, but normally the bigger bucks dominate the younger bucks and win all of the does. This buck could be as much as 8 years old. That's when they mature. After that, they may live another 5 or 6 years, but their antlers get smaller with age. Body mass may grow, just like an old man may grow a pot belly. You'll see mature bucks with a big, heavy, drooping belly at maturity. And Maine grows some big ones. The record is a buck well over 300 pounds. And every year there are a handful that are 250 pounds. Those are really spectacular creatures. The antlers, this is something I had a lot of questions about. The antlers drop anywhere from the end of December into March. And it really depends on the health of the animal and where he's active. They start to weaken as they dry out. And if he bangs into a tree or catches one on a shrub, it'll fall. It's not unusual that they'll drop them both at the same time in the same place. And a lot of people hunt them because they have value. In China, people still believe that ground up antlers are a great aphrodisiac, but of course there's no substance to that. But you can sell antlers like this for $10 a pound. And spectacular antlers like this guy's would sell for a substantial amount of money. They start to grow again almost immediately. By April, they're regrowing from these two things on his head called a pedicle, and it just repeats the same cycle as the year before. One of the things that they do in the fall, this would begin to happen around October. They will rub their antlers, their velvet's long gone, but they're rubbing on these saplings to leave signposts. It also serves to strengthen their muscles, their front shoulders, their neck, for the battles that will come down the road into the breeding season. They're obviously leaving visual signposts. I've seen 3, 4, 5 of these in a row in the woods. But they're also depositing scent. They have scent glands at the base of their antlers. So when they do that, they're leaving scent. Sometimes they'll lick the tree as well. And that tells other bucks, hey, I'm in the area, you better be careful. This is another feature that a lot of people don't understand. Into October, mid-October, late October, you'll begin to see places like this in the woods where the deer have scraped the leaves away and grass, whatever. And this is called, not surprisingly, a scrape. While they dig this way, they're actually leaving scent from scent glands between their two hooves. And they'll also urinate in these spots, and that leaves scent, pheromones, hormones on the ground that other deer are very keen to smell and detect what's going on. As they get closer to the breeding season, the bucks in particular are trying to smell a doe coming into estrus because that indicates that there's an opportunity to breed with her. The rut is the term used for the breeding session, or the breeding season, excuse me. In Maine, that starts around the 4th or 5th of November and peaks around the 10th to the 12th of November, and then tapers off through the rest of the month. There is a second estrus period for does in December, those that were not mated in the first go round, but it's a much quieter period than what takes place in November. And the bucks are on the move constantly. They are very aggressive. They're looking for estrus females. They're fighting to establish the right to breed, prove their dominance. It's a serious time for the bucks, and they can get some serious injuries. Sometimes these antlers lock together, and then it's a death sentence for both of the bucks. They are chasing does at peak activity. If the doe comes into estrus, the bucks will literally chase her through the woods or fields, trying to be the one to breed with her. This is an interesting photograph. You may think that this guy is roaring or snorting or something like that, but he's actually opening his mouth and pulling back his lips to pick up the scent of a female in estrus. This is called the flamen response. I've seen the term flamening as well, although that doesn't slip off your tongue so easily. He has special olfactory glands in his mouth that he's using to try to sense that female. As you can tell, the rut to the breeding season is a compelling period that drives a lot of whitetail behavior. The buck that wins the battle, if you will, is normally a dominant buck, large in size, aggressive, large antlers, and the doe makes the decision. She's only in estrus for 24 to 30 hours on average, and she will only breed once, so she is selective. She's looking for a buck that displays the genetic features that would best allow her to pass on her genetics and sustain the herd over time. The buck is fickle. Once he has bred this doe, he may spend some time with her, but he's generally off within a few hours trying to find another willing female. You'll notice the tail on the doe. It's pointing straight out the back, and this is combined with her posture where she has her head down and her front feet out. She's indicating a willingness to breed with that buck. And the bucks lose a lot of weight during this period of time. I thought you'd like to look at some genetic variations here. The doe on the left is not an albino. You'll notice the black eyes, the black nose, and the black or dark lining of her ears. This is a leucistic deer, a white deer. In the Finger Lakes area where I'm from, around Seneca Lake, there's a herd of about 250 white deer that breed true. They have a genetic characteristic to allow that. The deer in the middle is an albino, and you can see the difference readily. The nose, the eyes, the ears give her away compared to the one on the left. The doe on the right is similar to the white deer on the left. This is called a leucistic deer or a piebald deer, similar to an Appaloosa horse. It's an absence of color in the cells, the hair cells on parts of her body. And you'll see combinations all over the place, a few patches of white to almost a full white one like you're seeing on the left. I thought you might enjoy this deer. This is a very spectacular buck, but you'll notice he has a very unusual formation to those antlers. They're not only very wide, but he has all kinds of extra points on them. There's on the brow tines that come up just above his eyes, out to the side. He even has a couple of tines coming down. Those are called drop tines and are very unusual. You would see those only in about 1 in 100,000 bucks. I was lucky enough to see one of these in Wyoming years ago, and it was really a treat. He was running across in front of me at about 250 yards, so I didn't see him very long, but through the binoculars, I could see his antlers, and really a treat. One of the things that is important to talk about is feeding of deer. A lot of people like to feed deer, they like to see them, they think they're helping the deer, but in fact, it's not kind to the deer. Their digestive tract changes completely in the winter because they're not eating the foods that I showed you up front. They're eating twigs and buds and things like that. Their metabolism, their biome, if you will, changes completely. And if suddenly they're eating nutrient-rich, high carbohydrate foods like corn, that can be harmful to the deer, and in an extreme case can literally kill the deer. It also serves to concentrate deer, making them more susceptible to predation by coyotes, for instance. But it also brings them across the road and your backyard, whatever. And it is technically illegal in Maine to feed deer. A lot of people do it, and the game wardens don't like to go around and enforce this, but in Maine and I think 35 other states, it is illegal to feed them. We'll talk a little bit about predation now. Deer are large animals. They can run like the wind and they have wonderful senses, but they are susceptible to predation. The primary predator in Maine these days would be the coyote. A lot of people believe that coyotes are responsible for dropping the deer population in northern Maine, but that's not the case. That's mostly because of habitat changes. As old marginal farms were abandoned and reverted to forest, they became less attractive for deer. And the truth is that southern Maine is really the northern edge of the traditional deer habitat. They don't thrive well in really cold winters with deep, deep snow like a moose can. They do better in more southern climates. Coyotes hunt in packs, of course, and they're normally picking off either the fawns or injured deer. They've been hit by a car, for instance. They're old, they're sick, they've broken a leg. That's primarily what coyotes are taking advantage of. But we have other predators in Maine as well, and I wanted to just talk briefly about them. The upper left is a bobcat. They only weigh at maturity about 30 to 40 pounds, but they're big enough and strong enough to handle a deer. They tend to jump on the back and bite the neck with their very powerful jaws. The cat on the lower left is a lynx. Looks similar to the bobcat, but larger. They can be 40, 50 pounds and much stronger. The black bear generally would not capture an adult deer, but they are very aggressive at finding fawns. They have such a sensitive nose that they can pick off fawns that other predators would not. And when the bears come out of hibernation in the spring, one of their favorite foods would be deer carcasses, deer that have died in the snow, for instance. That's a primary source of protein for them. And then I've showed you a cougar. We'll talk about that in a new presentation later this year when my next book comes out, but cougars eat an awful lot of deer if they can catch them. We can't really talk about deer without talking about tick-borne diseases, and it's unfortunate, but a researcher out of Maine Med in Portland described deer, the overpopulation of deer, particularly in southern Maine, as a human health hazard. And that is really quite a change from past situation. Nationwide, over 500,000 Lyme cases are reported in an average year these days, but that's probably only 10% of the total cases. Lyme disease is caused by a bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi, and fortunately, it is a bacteria that is treatable by antibiotics, or we'd be in trouble. The key creature to host Lyme disease and to feed the first stage of the tick is that little mouse up on top. A lot of people don't realize, however, that birds like the robin and wild turkeys can carry ticks, and when birds like robins migrate, they're shedding ticks and spreading them. Chipmunks and squirrels also can harbor ticks, but they're not the primary carrier like the mice are. And then the white-tailed deer. If you're feeding deer in your yard, you're inviting them into your yard, you're encouraging ticks, because a mature deer infected with ticks will drop hundreds of them over the course of a few months, and you don't want them in your yard. This representation shows the cycle where eggs hatch in the spring. Not too far from now, we're having very warm weather now, and ticks will begin to emerge, forming the larva stage, and they will find their way to a mouse or a bird, small creatures, and get their first meal. And then there's a big risk of infection for us in the late spring and summer when we're walking around, because the nymph stage is looking to attach itself to us, hanging on vegetation. If you stick to the trails, you've got a better chance, but still you can stumble onto ticks very easily. In the fall, of course, then the adults are looking for their last blood meal, because the female is going to lay her eggs in the leaf litter, and just repeat the cycle all over again. I thought it was interesting to show some statistics here for the deer tick, as it's called, or the black-legged tick that you see in these two photos. 45% of the ticks sampled in southern Maine a couple of years ago carried the bacteria for Lyme disease, and that's growing. Anaplasmosis and babesiosis are two more serious diseases than Lyme disease, and they have not been prominent in the past, but they're growing rapidly in prevalence in our deer tick population. A few ticks carry a virus, Powassan virus, and that is not susceptible to antibiotic treatment. So that takes it to a whole nother level. And then a lot of people, in numbers, but about 3%, I believe, of people who get full-bore Lyme disease suffer from what's called post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. It's like chronic fatigue and manifests as arthritis, nerve damage, brain confusion, all kinds of symptoms, and can go on for many years. It's no fun for those people. Further bad news, we have a new tick in Maine the last few years called the Lone Star tick. It's originally from the southeast, Texas, Alabama, places like that. Unfortunately, it carries diseases that are more serious than Lyme disease. Alpha-Gal syndrome results in an allergy to red meat. It's relatively new, so they can't say how long it lasts, but it appears to be a permanent allergy. A woman in Harpswell was documented with this a couple of years ago, and so this is not a theoretical risk for those of us who live in Harpswell. Ehrlichiosis and Rocky Mountain spotted fever are rare in Maine so far, not in other parts of the country, but these are serious diseases that can put you in the hospital and in extreme cases can kill you. Tularemia is normally transmitted by bears, pigs, rabbits, for instance, but the Lone Star tick can carry that and pass that to a human and cause liver problems. The other factor with too many deer is road hazard. We used to live in the Rochester, New York area, and there was a big public park in town that had a huge overpopulation of deer, and there literally were thousands of car accidents. In Maine, there are 3,300 collisions a year caused by deer. Nationwide, over a million. And the property damage for cars and other things, it approaches $5 billion nationally. So again, this is not a small issue. 200 people a year lose their lives because of deer collisions. So what do we do about deer? Well, this is a relatively new problem. When we turned to the year 1900, there were fewer than 500,000 deer in the country. They had been hunted to extinction. Development had pushed them out of the natural habitat, but they have recovered unbelievably well. There are now more deer in the United States than there were in historic times. And the most recent estimate is about 34 million of them. In fact, too many in many areas, because they have adapted to suburbia. We all grow nice, lush green grass. We have landscaping. People use non-native plants that are very attractive to deer, and they can do very well living amongst our homes. There have been experiments to try to relocate deer. People thought, well, we'll just move them out of suburbia and put them back in the wilderness. Unfortunately, it's cruel, and about 95% of the deer die from the stress of being captured and netted, put in a truck and transported. It does not work. Similarly, with attempts to sterilize deer, catching them, injecting them. People have tried food laced with sterilizing agents. It just does not work. So the truth is that the only way to manage deer effectively is with hunting. Fortunately, Maine has a long tradition, and about 90% of people in Maine in surveys say that they support deer hunting for various reasons. And our population currently is around 250,000 and growing, and about 30,000 deer are harvested in an average year. That's a lot of protein. When you figure that the average deer is probably 125 pounds, you would get somewhere around 50 to 60 pounds of protein out of that wonderful organic meat. So the truth is that deer are lovely creatures. We're lucky to have them. We enjoy looking at them, having them around. But like anything else, an excess can be a problem. And unfortunately, in Maine today, that problem is growing. And we have to hope that tick-borne diseases and other problems associated with deer populations can be managed. Otherwise, it creates an even bigger human health hazard. Just wanted to mention the book is available through the Land Trust website or at the office if you're interested. There's also an e-book version for those that like their Kindles and computers. And there'll be a new book out very soon. Julia and Tim McCrate and I have been working on that. Hopefully it'll be available this summer. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks, Ed. So I encourage you all to post any questions that you have in the chat. And maybe, Ed, you could stop sharing your screen so we can see our faces a little bit better.
Yeah.
All right. So I had one question that I thought of as I was listening to you talk. I thought it was curious that the deer start growing their new antlers soon after they lose their old ones. And given the amount of energy that it must take to grow them, I wonder, what is the benefit to losing the antlers at all?
Well, in the winter, they're generally in thicker cover, and the antlers would be a problem for them. And part of their cycle, their breeding cycle, is to grow larger antlers and become more dominant and appear more dominant and therefore attractive to does. So they need to drop their small antlers and grow successively larger ones. It's also a mechanism for returning nutrients to the earth. If you find old antlers on the ground, you'll often notice that they've been chewed on. Porcupines love them, mice, and even deer will chew on antlers to try to get particularly calcium, but magnesium and other minerals off those antlers.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Peter Shiras who asks, what is the population of deer in Harpswell? Is it growing or stable, and what management steps, if any, are needed?
I don't know that anybody would have a number perhaps the biologists have tried to estimate that, but I don't think there's any question that deer are growing in numbers in Harpswell. Part of the problem is that more houses, more restrictions on hunting, and the last 3 winters have been relatively mild. In an average 10-year period in Maine, you would have a couple of harsh winters, maybe 3 or 4 harsh winters that would kill large numbers of deer if they can't get enough food. But we haven't had that cycle. So the deer population just continues to grow. If a doe is dropping twins or triplets every year, and she lives for 10, 12 years, obviously that has a big impact on the population. Maine allows hunting in Harpswell from early September through mid-December with archery or firearms, and is very generous with the permits. Also includes the islands of Harpswell. So that's the way they're trying to manage the numbers.
All right. We have a question from Eric Robinson, must be a relative of yours.
Yes.
Do does develop more than one fawn at a time based more on random chance or the health of the habitat?
I don't think it's chance. I mean, obviously there's some aspect of that, just as there is in human birth. But a young doe in her first breeding season is quite likely to develop just one fetus and deliver one fawn. As she gets older, then she's capable of 2 or 3. But it really is driven by her health and the health of the habitat.
And another question from Sarah Chandler. Do deer live in herds in Harpswell? How large is a herd?
Normally you will see clusters of does, and it would generally be 1 or 2 mature does with their offspring from the current year and possibly a yearling from the previous year. Bucks tend to be solitary. You will sometimes see 2 or 3 bucks of different age groups or similar age groups hanging together, but certainly in the late summer and through December, they're mostly solitary because they're very competitive with each other.
And you mentioned earlier that there was a doe with antlers, and does that happen, and how does that happen?
That can happen 2 ways. In some cases, it would be a genetic abnormality, but most of the does or deer that appear to be does and have antlers on their head are actually hermaphrodites. So they carry both male and female genes and produce a very respectable set of antlers. It was an 8-point doe harvested a few years ago in northern Maine, and I mean, you would have had a very difficult time telling that was not a large buck. She was over 200 pounds.
Wow. There's another question about how well do deer swim. I've certainly seen pictures of them swimming. People have sent them to me, pictures of them swimming in the ocean, in fact. But how well do they swim?
First of all, their long guard hairs are hollow. So particularly in the winter, they can swim extremely well. And it's well known that deer will leave the mainland and move to islands during the hunting season, trying to find peace and quiet. But they have a lot of fat on their bodies in mid to late summer. That helps with flotation. And even though their legs are thin and their hooves are not very substantial, they can swim readily. And they've been seen swimming miles across gaps in the Gulf of Maine. A couple of years ago, maybe it was 5 years ago, a lobsterman photographed a couple of deer that were like 6 miles offshore, swimming in the wrong direction in that case, and he was able to grab them and bring them into the boat and then deliver them back to the mainland. Nice of him to do that, but they can travel long distances in the water.
Mm-hmm. That's all the questions that I see. Let's give everyone one last chance to ask any questions that you have about deer. Give people a minute to ask any more.
I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards. You can contact me by email or phone, or contact me through the office anytime.
Great. Yeah, and do keep an eye out for that new book coming out this year. Oh, there's one more question about ticks. I'm actually surprised we didn't get more questions about ticks.
Uh,
Asking about the best tick protection strategies.
I'll say right up front, I have two very thorough articles on ticks, tick-borne diseases and tick protections on the Land Trust website. So you want to check those out. They were done in 2019 and 2020, I think, but they're very accurate. The key thing is to avoid ticks in the first place, and that obviously means don't walk in brushy, thick cover unless you have clothing that has been treated. I like to wear chaps or leggings to cover the gap between my boots and my pants. Some people tuck their pants into their socks, but that means you're going to get a boot full of weed and debris and stones and things like that. And a tick could get into your boot. But I think if you are protecting yourself with permethrin and the sprays that are available for treating your clothing, or you buy clothing that's already pre-treated, it makes a big difference. That will kill ticks pretty quickly. Evidence shows, I think within 20 minutes, a tick on treated clothing will die. Obviously, the other part of it is to check your body. When you come in from walking in an area where ticks are present, you have to do the check. And sometimes that means having somebody help you check parts of your body that aren't so visible. But if you get a tick, there are very specific instructions for removing that tick. And don't use a match, don't put hot oil on it and some of these other treatments. Get yourself an apparatus that's made for removing a tick. Save the tick and go see a doctor, watching yourself for symptoms, because immediate treatment with antibiotic knocks out almost all cases of Lyme disease and babesiosis, anaplasmosis.
Great, thanks. And I'll just type our web address since you've directed people to that. We do have those tick articles and lots more wildlife articles. I put that in the chat. Okay, well, I think that's the end of our questions, but thank you all for joining us, and thanks for your talk, Ed, and sure we'll have you back again to give another talk in sometime in the future.
You're welcome. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Good night, everyone.